Welcome. In this deep dive, we're exploring two major theories of consciousness: integrated information theory, or IIT, and global neuronal workspace theory, GNWT.
We're drawing on a fascinating paper, really, called Adversarial Testing of Global Neuronal Workspace and Integrated Information Theories of Consciousness.
And our goal is to unpack how each theory explains, that subjective feeling of being aware and how it links to what's happening in the brain.
What's quite unique here is the approach. It was an adversarial collaboration
Meaning proponents of both theories, plus some neutral scientists, actually work together.
to design experiments that could potentially tell the theories apart based on their predictions.
And why should you care? Well, understanding consciousness has profound implications. Think medicine, society, ethics.
So this is a way to get up to speed on a really central scientific debate.
Let's start with the basics. IIT, what's the core idea?
IIT views consciousness as an intrinsic property of a system, specifically a neural network's ability to influence itself.
And they quantify this.
Yes, with a measure called phi. High phi means high integration, high consciousness, potentially. IIT suggests the posterior cortex, the back of the brain, is the main hot zone.
Okay, and GNWT, how does that differ?
GNWT is more about communication. Consciousness emerges when information is sort of broadcast widely across different brain networks.
Made globally available.
And the prefrontal cortex, the front part of the brain, is seen as crucial for this broadcasting process.
Directly testing the deep mathematical parts of these theories is hard.
Very difficult. So this study focused on where they predict consciousness happens biologically. Posterior cortex for IIT, prefrontal for GNWT.
Which brings us to the first set of predictions. Where is conscious content located?
IIT predicts you'll find the best decoding of what someone's seeing, say, a face or an object, in those posterior areas.
While GNWT argues the prefrontal cortex, the PFC, is necessary, it has to be involved in representing that content.
So they tested this using multiple methods. Intracranial EEG, or iEEG, right inside the brain.
MEG, measuring magnetic fields outside the head.
And fMRI, looking at blood flow changes. A multi-pronged approach.
What did the iEEG show for location?
They could decode face versus object in both posterior and prefrontal areas, but it was much more accurate and sustained in the posterior regions.
And in the PFC?
Lower accuracy, and the signal was very brief. They also looked at decoding the orientation of something.
Like, is it tilted left or right?
That decoding was pretty consistent in the posterior cortex, but mostly missing in the PFC.
What about MEG? Did it align?
MEG also showed decoding for faces and objects in both posterior and prefrontal regions, again within the expected time windows for each theory.
Sustained in the back, brief in the front.
That's generally what they saw, yes. Sustained posterior, transient prefrontal.
And fMRI, the blood flow measure.
Here they found really robust decoding in several posterior areas, visual cortex, temporal areas. Again, much weaker and more limited decoding in the PFC.
So across different methods, the signal seems stronger and more sustained posteriorly.
It does lean that way. Then they did another test. What if you combine the signals?
Add the PFC information to the posterior information. Does it help decode better?
The iEEG and MEG results suggested no. Adding PFC data didn't improve category or orientation decoding.
Yay.
Sometimes it even made it slightly worse.
Statistical tests back this up.
Yes, Bayesian analysis indicated the PFC wasn't adding significant decoding power beyond what was already in the posterior cortex.
Okay, let's move to the second prediction. This one is about time. How is conscious content maintained?
IIT's view is straightforward. Continuous activity in that posterior hot zone keeps the experience going. Active maintenance.
GNWT has a more dynamic picture.
Yes, they predict a brief, content-specific ignition in the PFC when the stimulus appears, maybe 300 to 500 milliseconds.
And then again when it disappeared.
Correct. An onset and an offset burst.
Yeah.
In between, they suggest the content might be stored non-consciously, maybe in synaptic patterns.
So what did the iEEG data say about this timing?
Crucially, they didn't find that onset and offset pattern in the prefrontal cortex electrodes, as GNWT predicted.
Interesting. Did they find it anywhere?
They did see that pattern in some other brain regions, just not the PFC areas highlighted by GNWT.
What about sustained activity, like IIT predicts?
They use a technique called representational similarity analysis over time. This showed sustained representation of object categories in the posterior cortex.
Which fits IIT better?
It aligns more closely with the IIT model, yes. In the PFC, they saw a brief category signal at onset, but not offset. and it didn't really match the specific GNWT onset-offset model.
What about finer details, like the specific object or its orientation?
Information about the object's identity was sustained in posterior areas, again fitting IIT, but this was absent in the PSC.
And orientation?
Face orientation information was weak overall, not really sustained even in the posterior cortex, and completely absent in the PSC according to the iEEG.
Let's turn to the MEG results for timing. Do they clarify things?
Not really. Looking at high-frequency gamma band activity didn't clearly support either theory's timing predictions in posterior or prefrontal areas.
And lower frequencies.
Alpha band activity was also inconclusive.
But what about that representational analysis over time using MEG?
Similar to iEEG, it showed sustained category information posteriorly, fitting IIT better, and transient onset activity in PFC, but again, no GNWT-style onset-offset pattern.
So the MEG data overall didn't strongly back either theory's timing model for category identity or orientation.
It was less clear-cut than the iEEG, perhaps, but certainly didn't provide strong confirmation for either.
Prediction 3 focused on connectivity, how different brain areas talk to each other.
GNWT predicts specific connection patterns involving the PFC, enabling that global broadcast. iIT predicts connections mainly within the posterior cortex supporting integration.
Did they find evidence for these specific patterns?
One measure they used, looking at phase consistency, didn't support either theory strongly.
But they also looked at dynamic connectivity, how connections change over time.
Yes, using iEEG, they saw brief connections between object selective areas and early visual cortex.
And connections involving the PFC.
They did find connectivity between the PFC and both face and object selective areas happening in the gamma frequency band within the time frame GNWT would predict.
What about dynamic connections in MEG?
MEG showed brief dynamic links in alpha-beta bands between face areas and both the PFC and early visual cortex.
And fMRI connectivity.
The fMRI analysis showed some weak evidence of content-specific connectivity, but nothing that clearly matched the strong predictions of either theory.
So, pulling it all together, what are the main takeaways or challenges?
Well, several findings challenge IIT. The lack of sustained synchronization within the posterior cortex in EEG and MEG is one.
And the weak representation of orientation, especially sustained representation.
Exactly. For GNWT, a major challenge is the missing ignition signal at stimulus offset in the PFC in the iEEG data.
And also the limited representation of specific content, like object identity and orientation in the PFC.
Which seems to contradict the idea that the PFC broadcasts the rich, detailed content of our experience.
So neither theory came out completely unscathed.
No, the results presented specific empirical challenges for both. It doesn't mean they're wrong necessarily, but suggests they need refinement.
It really underscores that consciousness research is very much ongoing. This study provides crucial data points.
And it highlights the value of this adversarial approach, forcing specific, testable predictions.
It pushes the science forward, even without a final verdict.
Definitely.
So a final thought for you, the listener. Reflect on these findings. Does your own subjective experience feel more like a continuously integrated state in one part of your brain, or more like information being broadcast widely?
Or perhaps elements of both, or neither, seem to capture it. Thinking about how these scientific models relate or don't relate to your own awareness is part of the ongoing exploration.